webinar on the European Grids package from policy to power. My name is Neumann. I'm Advocacy Director at ChargeUp Europe, and I will be moderating our panel today. But before we get started, maybe some introductory remarks. First of all, about ChargeUp Europe. Not everyone may be familiar with our association. We're the European Association of the Charging Infrastructure industry. Our 50+ members come from charging point manufacturers, charging point operators, e-mobility service providers, roaming platforms. So we cover the entire ecosystem of EV charging in Europe today. With that, we can dive into the substance. Nowadays, a charging point operator deploying charging infrastructure is a pretty lengthy and sometimes very complex process, right? From searching for an appropriate location to securing the land to, topic of today, securing the grid connection, construction works, station management, etc. It can take quite a while before charging from the initial plans is actually becoming operational. And we'll talk today specifically about grid connections, which can still be a key bottleneck in deploying charging today. And in fact, when we ask our members, they really consistently name charging infrastructure bottlenecks. They name the prime one as the grid connection. So there's several issues related to grid connections. First of all, often it takes a long time to actually establish a grid connection point. And it's a quite lengthy, complex and bureaucratic process to get one in many cases. Many hoops to jump through administratively. And then even when the process is streamlined, often there's just not enough grid capacity, right? In some European member states, we're really hitting physical limit of what the grid infrastructure can accommodate, especially at a local level and especially for fast charging. And that can lead to big delays of sometimes months, sometimes even years, particularly for the fast charging that is becoming increasingly the norm and increasingly more common. So as the rollout accelerates, we're running into grid bottlenecks for new fast chargers. And therefore, we need solutions that simplify, digitalize, and accelerate the rollout of charging infrastructure, make the grid connection procedures simpler, the permit granting for grid connection simpler, and are workable for all parties involved. So for our members, for charging point operators, but also for the system operators, for national regulators, and for public authorities. And that's why I'm very happy that today we have a panel that basically reflects all these different perspectives. Yeah, welcome to our panelists. I'm going to give you the floor maybe one after the other to introduce yourself, but very happy to have indeed the CPO perspective, the regulator perspective, and the DSO perspective here. And so maybe I'll give you the floor to introduce yourself with the first question already, which is from your perspective nowadays, where is the gap that we're seeing when it comes to EV charging deployment on the one hand and infrastructure and grid readiness on the other hand? So yeah, where is that gap? Where is it most acute? Maybe we start with Gabrielė.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gabrielė. I'm the EV charging policy lead for EMEA region at Tesla. I'm also the co-chair of the Grids Task Force at ChargeUp Europe. So very happy to be here today, and thank you for having me. To answer your question, Thomas, yes, of course, there is a gap. It's pretty much all across the EU. In some countries, the issues will be the permitting. In some countries, it will be the grid connection itself. In some countries, it will be both. There are different reasons for that. There are countries in Europe where there is a delay in the upgrades of the grid infrastructure. So for the distribution level, which is where we normally connect the public EV charging infrastructure, that will be sometimes 6 to 8 years. For transmission level, that's even more. And so it depends per country whether you deal with the distribution or the transmission level. So that's also to be taken into account. And sometimes that relates to the grid connection, but also to permitting as well, due to highly bureaucratic, fragmented procedures inside the country, particularly, for example, in Southern Europe, Spain, Italy. The bottlenecks are really at the permitting regime. So the powers are kind of distributed between the federal, regional, and local levels. Some of them, and oftentimes they interpret the European law or the regulations from even like federal regulations, national regulations differently. So the national authority will interpret the regulation in one way, and the local authority in a different way. So that provides for a big for a big maze of complexity, trying to sort of navigate those requirements. And then, of course, no two countries are the same. So, of course, in every country, it will be different. And for us, most of the charge point operators, at least the biggest ones, operate cross borders in Europe. And so every single time you enter a new country or want to enter a new country, you basically have to spend significant resources to figure out how this process works. It's often in a language that nobody speaks. And so that's, there is no harmonization even sometimes within a country, but country to country neither at all. And that's kind of a result of a siloed way of working. So there is no harmonized EU framework for grid access for EV charging, and also the EV charging infrastructure targets that are in AFIR. We're not really informed by the available grid capacity. So this is, why we have, on the one hand, the regulatory framework that's pushing for the deployment of charging infrastructure, which is obviously needed. And we as the charging sector are really doing our very best to work with the regulatory framework that we have. But then, on the other hand, the grid capacity is not necessarily there, or the way that it's being managed is not optimized for the off-peak times. And so regardless of how fast we as charging infrastructure operators can be ready to deploy, which, in some cases can be 3 months on our side, in 3 months we can be ready, the administrative burdens, the permitting, and then also the lack of grid capacity often slows down or even kills the project at the end of the day because of how much it's being delayed. It's not possible to wait for that long simply because the business implications are too high if we do.
Thanks, Gabrielė. Very clear. So a lot of fragmentation issues, lots of differing requirements, long timelines. Maybe I'll bring next in Raphael Hanoteaux. Raphael, maybe briefly introduce yourself and your take on what's currently going wrong and why grid connections sometimes take so long.
Yes, thank you, Thomas. Hi, everyone. Very happy to be taking part in this webinar. Just very quickly on CEER, we're the voice of European national regulatory authorities, so energy regulators, and we have 38 members and observers all across Europe. So within the EU and also the EEA and other, I would say, adjacent parts of Europe. So we're trying to really represent the views. For us as energy regulators, really the primary mission is to ensure that the grids really act as an enabler of the new usages and the new consumption patterns. And so EVs are really one thing that is really, I think, very topical and very important. And what we want is really the grids also to enable this rather than to be the bottleneck. However, at this stage, it's the real talking point is about how it is a bottleneck. So concretely, how do we move forward? We need to move away from this kind of traditional static modeling that we saw in the past, which was, also historically underestimating EV consumption pattern and really playing down this kind of new usage and new consumption pattern. So what we need is a more objective and data-driven representation of how decentralized demand actually behaves on the ground. And there is, again, this whole issue, at least for regulators, between centralization and decentralization of demand and of new consumption pattern. Also, for regulators, the transition really requires us to solve the really critical lack of coordination between the distribution level and the transmission level. And Gabrielė already talked a bit about this, but for us, really, the distribution level is where things are really happening, where the vast majority of new charging infrastructure is currently struggling to connect, but it's also the point that is most often overlooked. Of course, to address these challenges, we have the grids package. We can move towards new scenarios and joint scenarios, streamline permitting, and basically giving legal certainty. But for us, and I think this is an issue that is, I would say, relevant for EVs, but also for a lot of usage at the moment, really the question and the assessment must really look at flexibility first assessment and really prioritizing non-wire solution, smart charging, demand response before committing to the traditional expensive grid expansion. That also means reinforcing the roles of regulators, obviously through their transparency, their independence, but also their financial support, at least that they have budget to actually do the task they are supposed to do, because we need really to ensure national and cross-border consistency when protecting the end users from inefficient cost. And that's always at the heart of the regulator thinking is really, okay, how do we manage risk? How do we manage cost? And ultimately, our goal is really to build a grid that is sound down, cost efficient, and also ready to support these new usages such as charging, for example. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Raphael. And that brings us to the last but not least, to the DSO perspective. And we have Laia Guitart here today. Laia, thanks for joining us as well. Yeah, happy to hear from you where you see the current failures or problems in the system and what the grid package should actually fix when it comes to getting charging infrastructure online.
Yes, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Laia Guitart. I'm a technology and policy advisor at E.DSO, where I am supporting the work that the association is doing on the topic of e-mobility. And I'm very happy to be here today talking about the grids package from the perspective of e-mobility. So from our perspective, there is indeed a gap that's emerging. And I would agree with what Gabrielė was saying earlier, that it is emerging all across Europe rather than in particular single countries. But it is visible, most visible at distribution level, which is where EVs must be connected. And in my opinion, or what we're seeing is that it is particularly evident in urban areas where grid capacity is already constrained due to other demand. In highway corridors and charging hubs where large scale connections are needed quickly, but permitting processes advance slowly. And then third, I would say it's in regions with aging infrastructure where grids were not designed for electrified transport. And I also see that there's an issue with timing, because EV deployment at the end responds to market advancements and it is accelerating quick, but then grid development follows longer planning and regulatory cycles. So there is a mismatch on those, which results in charging infrastructure projects facing connection delays that might kill the interest in the project, as Gabrielė was saying. And on the other hand, results on DSOs being forced into taking a reactive reinforcement, which at the end results in more time and more costs for everyone involved in the ecosystem, rather than proactive planning. And yeah, I think later on we will go deep dive. We'll deep dive in how the grids package can support us in moving. So I think for now I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much, Laia. Before I move into the second round of questions, point out to the audience really quickly, if you have questions throughout this webinar, feel free to leave them in the chat. My colleagues will pass them on. There will be a little Q&A at the end where also panelists will answer your questions, and we very much look forward to hearing from you. But with that, maybe Laia, come straight back to you, because you've kind of referred to the lack of more proactivity and being less reactive in planning. So I guess we're talking then about anticipatory grid investments. Is that on your view a key element? And what's currently kind of keeping DSOs from doing this kind of proactive planning? So what is actually needed on that side? Yes,
indeed. So first of all, we welcome very much the fact that the grid package acknowledges the need for anticipatory investments. We are missing exactly ways on how to implement them. And what we see with the topic of proactive investments is that, or anticipatory investment, is that the barrier that it is not really technical capability, because DSOs do already plan ahead, but it's more regulatory and framework conditions that will limit how far can DSOs go. So I would say that there are particularly three barriers that stand out, with the first being the regulatory and financial constraints, because DSOs are strongly regulated, and the current frameworks do not recognize the investments that are to be made well in advance. So the framework is reactive to when demand materializes instead of being proactive. So this means for DSOs that investing in an anticipatory way comes with very high uncertainty on cost recovery and also on returns, which doesn't make it particularly attractive. Then the other issue or the other barrier that is out there is that DSOs do not have sufficient information on where, when, and how will this demand materialize. So it's like investing without full visibility. And then the third barrier is that grid planning is not always aligned or has full visibility with urban planning, mobility planning, and other work streams or other streams that will influence the grids.
Okay, yeah, so a lack of visibility and a very reactive framework right now that basically only allows DSOs to then start deploying when demand has already materialized and when it's basically late.
Exactly.
Maybe that's actually interesting then, because Raphael, you've very much emphasized the role also of demand response, smart charging, etc., which can maybe help solve some of these bottlenecks. Do you think this is sufficiently reflected, and are we actually kind of planning for the right demand and right infrastructure model? So are we accurately modeling the demand that will come from EVs also in the future?
That's a good question. I'll be cautious on answering that we are actually doing this. What I can tell you is we're really moving away from an old model to a new model, right? We're moving from this kind of top-down modeling to bottom-up, and that's true for charging infrastructure, but that's true for EV, but also for rooftop solar, for heat pumps, for all of that, right? All these new consumption patterns need to emerge from the bottom and go up and be taken into consideration, when in the past we were really having a big kit and pushing power everywhere, and really you just needed to understand this from the top. I think at this stage we are getting very interesting proposals from the Commission, from member states and from the European Parliament. I think one of the big issue is really this idea of having a centralized and bottom-up scenario data coordinated by CEER, and having really a central scenario where we eliminate the need for each DSO to reinvent the wheel every time, right? Really having a regulatory certainty on where the patterns are, and if we can agree on that, which is also another I would say set of challenges. What we don't want really is to agree on the wrong infrastructure and reinforce the backbone where really the local needs are needed. And I'm not saying that the transmission level should not be reinforced, but there is really something about finding the right balance. And on this, we already used the keyword of anticipatory investments. This is really this idea of this no regret, and really moving from reaction and reactive reinforcement of the grid towards some guidance and some forward-looking network planning, where we really try to look at what are the no-brainer solutions to invest and manage the volatility, and also manage the demand much more, I would say, accurately and flexibly. So this is really where the challenge is.
Thank you, Raphael. So I think we have a bit of a problem definition now, in the sense that grid connection procedures take a while, but also we are kind of always behind the curve. So maybe to wrap this up and move into the next block already, which is then the assessment of the package that's on the table. Gabrielė, from a CPO, from a day-to-day perspective, I know you've already said this differs a lot between member states, but is the main problem really the lack of available grid capacity? Is it more about the connection timelines that are too slow? Is there not enough visibility of the timeline? And then with these main challenges in mind, what's your view on this overall package? So which provisions are actually most helpful in there from the perspective of the charging industry?
Yeah, thanks, Thomas. Yeah, I mean, in terms of like, let's say, systemic issues that we have, I think it all starts with the grid visibility gaps. So for charging infrastructure, we really need basically grids capacity, visibility up to this, all the way to the substation level, which is not really existing today in 19 member states out of 27. So that already makes it difficult for us to understand where is there really grid capacity today that we can, or where is there going to be grid capacity, because the planning and the investment roadmap is also not very clear most of the time. So that's kind of what's forcing us to apply blindly for the grid connections, because we cannot really, invest too much time into preparing a project and then kind of realize at the end that there's no grid capacity. So we have to start with applying for the grid capacity, but we have to do it blindly. And so that's, also feeding into the problem with the first come, first serve grid connection principle, which still is the default principle in a majority of the member states today, which, by the way, according to the European Commission's guidance that was part of the grids package, does not have to be the default principle. There are other ways to manage the grid connection queue, but this one is the most straightforward one, which is why most of the member states have chosen it. And so it feeds into this first come first served issue in that the grid connection queue doesn't favor projects with higher system benefits, and it's at the end of the day there's no aggregated data on how much grid capacity EV charging really needs today, because each connection request is treated one by one basically, so there's no aggregation. This can be done, I think, or this can be solved by introducing simply a filter when somebody is applying for a grid connection, so that the CPO can basically choose to say that, well, this is a connection request for EV charging, not necessarily to prioritize if the first come first serve is still the principle that the DSO chooses to manage its connection queue, but simply to understand what's the aggregated need for the capacity that there is. This has already been done for the renewables projects in the past, for solar and wind, so it's not a new concept basically, and it can definitely be implemented. And so of course I skipped a bit the step of permitting, because of course before we are able to deploy the infrastructure and have the grid connection, we of course need permitting. But today only 11 out of 27 member states have digital permitting systems, which essentially leads to overcrowded queues, and so that's also a big issue. So these are, let's say, three systemic failures. So it started already with grid visibility. On the permitting step we get stuck, and then the grid connection step we're also getting stuck. And then what can be fixed? I think the grids package is introducing quite a few interesting things in it. So for example, digital portals, as I said, not many member states today have digital portals or one-stop shops kind of for applying for permitting when it comes to EV charging. So it would be great if member states actually had a one-stop shop, kind of a digital portal for everything permitting related, grid connection related too, but that's a different issue which is not covered in a legislative way in the package. So the digital portals, that's one, and then of course the flexible connection agreements. This is something that when I speak with the regulators, I often hear about a lot of surprise that we are open to that. Of course, there needs to be certain bands or boundaries on how these connection agreements are established, but as a concept, we are open to it. And then, of course, moving away from the first come, first served principle into more first ready, first served. That's already in place, I know, in Spain, in Finland, I'm sure that in some other member states, by prioritizing projects that have system benefits, so that are allowing to optimize the already existing grid capacity, the off-peak grid capacity, because the problem is that there's always enough off-peak grid capacity, but all the grid connection requests are being evaluated against the on-peak capacity, which there is not enough of. And so yes, but of course this last part is just in the guidance, and so that will depend a lot on the willingness of the member states to actually take action and to implement this guidance voluntarily.
Thanks, Gabrielė. Quite clear. So in terms of digital portals, flexible connection, and first ready, first served, it's really where the grid package could make a difference. Maybe Raphael, from your perspective, from a regulator's perspective, is there anything to add? What's your assessment of the entire package? What do you welcome? Where are you maybe a bit more careful?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we're happy with the package. It's obviously very important to look at grids and to look also about the regulators' roles in the grids development, I would say. The first thing we want to say as regulators is also that we have a bunch of things that were agreed in the past and that still need to be implemented, transposed, and actually, put together within the member states, right? So there are a few things that are still lagging behind and dragging a bit, which need to be put into national law so that things get better. On the package itself, obviously, having regulators amending and approving network development plans and ensuring they are grounded in technical reality is important. The issues around permitting, and we've danced a bit around the issue, but I need to talk about this. Permitting is really important to really move from having fixed deadline, making sure we don't have sequence permitting, but also parallel and one-stop shop issues, so that we can move a bit faster on this, and especially that we give legal certainty to accelerate the development of an infrastructure that is needed. The question on joint scenario is really something that is interesting, and I think a bit I would say controversial at some point, because we do need centralized data to be consistent and to really have robust scenarios, but at the same time we also want them to be maybe having national sensitivities taken into account, right? Only looking at it from Brussels is also not completely a solution. So there is really a balance to be stricken between scenario making, but also having an agreement on where we go with national level sensitivities. This is also something that needs to encompass all energy carriers. So this is really something that is important. But I would say, really, when we talk about especially this issue, we need to also look at the cross-border aspect of it. And we know that there is really the strengthening of the CEER board of regulators, for example, to look at that. This is really a good step, but it is also something that we will be able to solve if we are a bit more proactive there. Just on the package itself, I think really one thing that is maybe not talked about enough is really the I would say the speed of the updates and the developments in the sector and on the energy sector in general. And even when we tie this up to the geopolitical developments, it's even speedier. So when we look at the regularity and how often do we need planning cycles, we also think that this is good to have a look at that, but maybe having it every 2 years rather than every 4 years would be quite useful. Thanks.
Thank you, Raphael. And yeah, with that, maybe then the last top level assessment, Laia. In terms of the DSO perspective, we've already talked, for example, about permitting, which in the definition of the grids package seems to also to include some steps by the system operator. So from your perspective, what do you think will really make a difference in this package, and what maybe needs a bit more of amending and maybe at this stage won't? So what do you welcome most?
Yeah, so maybe to start with, I wanted to mention that we very much welcome the grids package because it puts grids at the center of EU energy policy. And we welcome some key elements, in particular, the acceleration of permitting and connection processes, the recognition of anticipatory investments, as I was mentioning earlier on, and also the focus or the approach into some more forward-looking grid planning. And while it is clear by the name that the package does not attempt to really address issues related to EVs in a direct way, when looking at it from the perspective of e-mobility, I think that one can conclude that it is necessary but not sufficient to deliver e-mobility at scale. And this is because it does not create yet the right conditions for DSOs to anticipate EV-driven demand effectively, to finance the grid upgrades that are required to accommodate this demand, and also to deploy smart solutions that are needed to manage these more decentralized and more flexible loads. And then going at the particular provisions that I think will make a difference and the ones that will not work, I would say that for the one that will make a difference is the introduction of a maximum of 2-year time frame for permitting processes related to grid development projects. This is important because right now what we are seeing is that the problem with grid expansion is not only financing or planning, but also the timing. And this is because grid projects can take many years. Sometimes they even go up to a decade to receive full authorization. Also because processes are fragmented across multiple authorities, that also delays the process. And again, this creates this mismatch that hopefully will be addressed, because the infrastructure that is essential for the uptake of e-mobility takes too long to build, but demand is accelerating in an unprecedented way. And then, if I may very quickly go into what we believe that will not work, is the tacit approval of grid connections. And the reason is because it treats these connection requests as an administrative permits, and they are not. They are a technical assessment. They look into all the technical aspects related to this connection, and it poses a lot of risks related to system security if the proper technical assessments cannot be conducted. It does also raise issues with the liability of DSOs, because they would be responsible for connections that they did not manage to assess properly or conduct the right assessments. And then also it leads to cybersecurity issues. It can lead to cybersecurity issues, to issues with technical compatibility. And we believe that this provision risks creating more problems than it solves. But I think that we will maybe discuss this later on more in depth. So I think for now, I will leave it here.
Thanks, Laia. Yeah, let's maybe just stay there for a second and let me ask you directly the follow-up question then, because with the tacit approval, understood the opposition and the reasoning behind the opposition. The underlying deadlines that are established, for which, you know, if by then there is no response, the project is counted as approved. Do you think those are realistic in principle, and can there be more support maybe to ensure that these deadlines can be met so that tacit approval doesn't become so much of an issue? So what do you think about the underlying timelines that are set out?
So on this, the 3 months deadline for connection requests, I believe that are realistic and balanced. However, multiple times the ability to grant a connection or not does not depend only on the DSO. So there are many other multiple vectors that are involved. And also on this, I think it's important to mention that we are not so much in favor of differentiating the deadlines based on the installation size, because this could create incentives to maybe split projects into smaller units in order to fall below capacity thresholds and benefit from shorter processes and create even a bigger backlog of connection requests. So I think my key message on that is that, yes, it is realistic and it's balanced, but we need to take into consideration that it's not always on the DSO solely. It depends on other authorities that or other actors that are involved, and we cannot face the risk of having it tacitly approved if it's not possible to deal with it within 3 months.
Okay, very clear. Thank you. Yeah, maybe Raphael, what's your view on these timelines that are established? And do you think this grid package is actually going to help meaningfully reduce connection timelines in the next 2-3 years?
Thank you. I mean, yeah, for the timelines, I think, again, I wouldn't express myself on exactly the how many months we need. What we need is actually certainty, right? So that we have an actual idea of how much time any operator or any industry player will have to wait. That would already be a very good step forward and to be able to kind of move there. Then on really the gridlock connection queues, really the primary source is really not the law, the complexity of the law. It's also the question of ghost projects, right? The question of really having a transparency criteria for a maturity, and so that we really have other solutions as first come, first serve. Right? This is kind of, we're saying we're moving away from it, but what do we put forward and how do we actually assess? How do we have a system that actually makes sense is I think, the real question. The other thing I want to point out when we're talking about this is that, okay, we can also, we talk about backlog, we're talking about, connection queue and okay, this is this takes too much time to solve and to connect, and we're looking at sometimes short-term solutions to overcome this backlog and overcome these challenges. This is really interesting. Okay, there are some solutions, and we can eliminate some projects and speed up others. But I think the real question is really expansion of the grid, and how do we move from this kind of short-term and non-structural solution to a structural solution where you don't have to always fight, because when we're saying, okay, we deprioritize some projects because some other projects might be more mature and ready earlier, that doesn't mean that the projects that we are deprioritizing are not relevant. It just means they're maybe blocking, creating a backlog, and would be ready a bit later. But if you keep doing that, then you're just also doing, working on an urgency basis, and everything is urgent, and you're always running after the ball. I think what's really interesting and really important is to move towards solutions that are structural, that enable us to expand the capacity to connect projects and to connect everything, but also to have a solution that fits everyone, and not just constantly rearranging the queue, which is not what we would like to see.
Yeah, that's fair, and thanks for that differentiation and input. And we'll come back, I think, to the kind of queue management in a second. Maybe just very last question on timelines from my side to Gabrielė. With these new deadlines for the permitting that are set in the grids package and in the proposal on permitting, do you think those go far enough in really creating the predictability that charging operators need? So do you think these new timelines actually help in terms of planning charging projects?
I mean, I think realistically we have to, admit the fact that the legislative proposal is made in the context of the Renewable Energy Directive. And so the effectiveness at the end of the day of anything that will be agreed, which is going to take, first of all, still probably another year at minimum, will all depend on the national implementation. So, of course, we know that the national implementation track record of both RED 2 and RED 3 has not really been the best. In many member states, it's like non-existent or it's lacking. And so for the moment, very honestly, I don't see how this will create predictability, because even if the proposals are agreed, as I said, we're looking at least another year until the proposals are agreed, and then at least 2 more years until they're implemented, if they are implemented. And that's, really the key, the key problem that we have. Is that I think the conversation, of course, today is not the point of the conversation, but the conversation really needs to turn into, is a directive really the best legislative framework to enact these proposals and these changes, and whether a regulation would not have been a better a way to do so, because I think the intention of the European Commission is great, and this sort of action is very much needed. However, unfortunately, it all will depend on the national implementation at the end of the day. So for the moment, as it stands, I don't see how it would bring predictability for charge point operators short term, which is what we really need to unblock the bottlenecks to deploy EV charging infrastructure as soon as possible, to continue keeping up with the demand, and to continue reinforcing the message that the EVs are here to stay, and we want to provide the charging infrastructure. So shortly, no, I don't think it will. It brings predictability, and it won't in the short term.
Just quickly, Raphael, I saw you nodding quite enthusiastically while Gabrielė was elaborating on the need for potentially regulation rather than directive and for the need for implementation. I guess I'll give you the opportunity to add some remarks of your own on the implementation side of things.
No, both to say fair enough, that's a fair point. And I was talking about predictability, but it's true that when we're talking about these timelines and especially with directives, the predictability is, I would say, more a long-term goal or something that will be established at some point rather than that fix. And then I was also nodding a lot because again, I fully agree. For us, for NRAs, having, for example, oversight on TSO investments is something that you have in the directives, but some member states simply do not transpose the directive adequately. And as a result, some of our members do not have the powers, for example, to really have adequate oversight on a few on grid investment or grid projects, right? So it's not because it's agreed and stamped at the European Parliament and the Council and so on, and then the deadline is passed that it actually happens on the ground. And so sometimes, some stakeholders might be talking about a regulation or directive. I'm not going to say anything about that, but I agree with Gabrielė on the fact that it's not because it's out of Brussels that it's the job is done.
Indeed, recurring topic of implementation. Well, with that, I already teased a bit that we would come back to this, but Gabrielė, you mentioned the first ready, first served rather than first come, first served. Raphael, you've talked about the ghost projects that clog up the queues. What's your views on this kind of queue management? I think Laia, you also referred to it earlier. Should certain use cases get preference, such as EV charging, or what kind of criteria do you see most suitable there? Maybe we'll start with Laia.
Yeah, so on that, as you know, DSOs are technology neutral, so there is no legal ground for DSOs to give preference to one project or another. However, I think that it is very important that we have a clear legal regime that will allow DSOs to move away from from this first come first serve and to manage better these queues, because until the moment that this is there, DSOs will not be able to, or will be facing this first come first served approach to the queue management, because there is no regulation that will allow them to do differently. Maybe this to clarify that, because before I think Gabrielė mentioned that first come first serve is the mechanism that the DSO chooses, but it's more the one that the DSO is bound to if there is no other alternative regime that is approved by the member state. So it's not a choice.
Indeed, very clear. Thank you, Laia. And then, well, Gabrielė, Raphael, whoever of you wants to come in, what would then be a better model to allow DSOs to deviate? So what do you think should be in place instead of first come, first served? I'll leave it to whoever of you wants to.
Yeah, I'm happy to go next. I fully agree with you, Laia. I think that's indeed the missing piece of this conversation, is that, the initiative to make changes needs to come from the policy makers. But of course, I think DSOs and NRAs as well always have the opportunity to give feedback to the policy makers, and then of course based on political priorities and what's important, they make their own choices. But I think it can be a two-way conversation. But of course I fully agree that the DSOs themselves cannot decide to do one thing or another. It's all based on the legal framework that they operate in. I think when it comes to the prioritization, indeed, I agree. I would agree with Laia to a certain extent that we cannot prioritize a certain technology over another. But I think that again, energy infrastructure is part, I think, of the political objectives of member states and of the EU. And so if we want to use that energy infrastructure in line with the political objectives and in line with where we want to go, or where we see our continent evolving, I think that the way that they should be prioritized is more around certain principles. So, for example, energy efficiency first. Technologies that enable the integration of renewables, for example, into the grid, or the offtake of renewables from the grid. Can be something that could be prioritized. Public interest, for example, as well, right? So if we see that the public is supporting, better air quality, less emissions. If they're really into, certain technologies that should also be taken into account. And then, of course, system benefits. So if a technology is bringing system benefits, in charging's case, for example, that could be charging and storage collocated to cut a little bit the grid congestion, or to help manage the grid congestion at certain times of the day. That's also something that could be taken into account. And so then, in the taking these energy efficiency, public interest, and system benefits, and of course having a list of fair, non-discriminatory, objective criteria that everybody who's standing in the grid connection queue has and is exposed to and can work with to advance their grid connection request. I don't see how that is sort of, prioritizing one technology over another. It's just basically saying like, well, thank you, welcome to the queue. Now, if you want to advance, here is a criteria that's the same for absolutely everybody. And so you're welcome to work on the criteria if you want to be bumped to the top of the queue. And so that, I think, is a very objective way of managing the queue that can be, that could be, integrated. And that's, of course, for every, well, I don't know who, but probably a national level to decide. But that definitely, I think that there needs to be a little bit of prioritization. But once again, to reiterate that, I think the impetus needs to come from the policymakers and from the political level first, before it can be implemented on a the system level by DSOs and NRAs and other relevant actors.
Laia, you want to respond directly?
Yes, if I may, I wanted to say that I fully agree that DSO should be closely involved in these prioritization mechanisms, also because they have higher visibility on what they have in their own grids. And on this, we actually already delivered some recommendations to policymakers in multiple occasions on which kind of mechanisms, which kind of criteria we think that should be taken into consideration. And well, it's now been responded with this guidance that we are just discussing, that I hope that if well implemented, it can help streamlining the issues. But I agree that the problem is the time frame for this implementation.
Thanks, Laia. Very clear. With that, I will start bringing in some audience questions, at least weaving them in. And a quick reminder to the audience: we're very happy to get your questions in chat. So feel free to leave your questions. Raphael, I'm gonna bring you in because it's kind of on the same topic. We have a question in chat from Anne Richters. Could you agree with the statement? Grid congestion is often more of a supply side problem because of renewables rather than demand side problem. Adding more flexible demand could be a key solution here. This being the case, should flexible demand like EV charging not be prioritized? I think it's a good question for you. You talked earlier about flexibility already, and we're currently talking about the prioritization of different projects. So yeah, feel free to let us know. Is that something that you would support? Yeah, happy to hear.
Yeah, I mean, of course, flexibility first is really something that needs to be taken into account. For us, it's really part of a package, right? Looking at the risk that we are looking at when we're talking about grid expansion, especially when we're talking about hardcore wire, like more wires, it means more investments, it means more risk, it means looking at that, having oversight on the projects, making sure we are able also to follow them, right? Because you can greenlight a project at some point, and then the project might take more time or be more expensive than expected, and you kind of need to have some rendezvous clause and get back to it. So this is what we have to face whenever we talk about this. So flexible demand, anything that brings flexibility and non-wire solution is obviously a net positive. In terms of flexible demand itself, we have this thing called FCF, flexible connection agreements, that are very important. But again, from the point of view of regulators, it also means that regulators need to have a mandatory verification, right? Verifying scenario data to see if actually flexibility is featuring there, but also verification of the project themselves, or having this oversight. Again, I'm underlying this because this is not always the case. So is definitely something where if we want regulators to be able to do their job properly, we also need to give them the tool, and then you can actually have this move towards more flexibility. I just see that the question after was also about digitalization, and I think this is a very very continuous point. Flexibility and digitalization all go hand in hand. I would also just maybe warn people against the idea that if you digitalize everything, then everything becomes more flexible, right? Because we've seen that it's not always the case, and we all, of course, we need the hardware. You need smart metering when we talk about individual consumption and all of that to be able to be more flexible and more digitized. But it's not because you have a smart meter that your consumption becomes more flexible. And we've seen that in some countries, in Finland or other countries that have a very high level of digitization, that you do not have necessarily more flexibility. What you need is also the economic incentive and the incentive for, I would say, demand, but also for supply and for network operators. The incentive framework and package needs to be in place so that you have more flexibility. It's not all about digitization and having a smarter system.
Thanks, Raphael. Quite clear. And thanks for addressing both questions in the chat directly. So yeah, again, audience, feel free to come in the meantime. Maybe one aspect that was just mentioned for the first time, Raphael, and that we haven't actually talked about yet in much detail is the flexible connection agreements. And that is a very key element for the charging infrastructure industry. So maybe Gabrielė, bringing you in, why are FCAs so important from our industry's perspective? And actually, does the grid package go far enough in addressing these, or is there the need to do anything more with flexible connection agreements?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, I think the flexible connection agreements were also part of the electricity market design legislation back in 2024. Again, pending national implementation, of course, but that's already covered actually in other relevant legislation as well. So definitely, as I was already saying before, flexible connection agreements are an important tool, and I think they will continue to be an important tool, especially in the short, medium term, while the grid receives the needed upgrades or the grid management approach evolves to make more use of the existing grid capacity through optimizing it rather than building more and more to make profit, which is the model that's prevailing today. Again, not necessarily to the choice of grid operators, but that's just how the entities were set up. So definitely, I think for CPOs, flexible connection agreements are important, but they have to be done right. So there are, certain conditions such as clarity. So the terms need to be decided really together between the charging of infrastructure operators and the grid operators. What are the curtailment rules, tariffs, how far in advance we get the signal that will have to provide flexibility, and so on. When is the firm capacity going to be available? I think, even if the initial connection is happening with a flexible connection agreement, which we do welcome very much, because at least we can connect now instead of have to wait for 5 years, for example, in some cases, or 10 years in some cases, especially for fast charging stations, public fast charging infrastructure. Firm connection is still the ultimate goal, because we are, our business is to give as much power as possible, as quickly as possible, so the driver can continue their journey. And so that, has to be part, let's say flexible connection agreements are not the solution. They're just like a patch on a wound, but the wound also needs to be treated eventually. So that also needs to be agreed without knowing when the firm capacity will be available. It's hard to enter into a flexible connection agreement as well. Because it makes it difficult. So I would say, yes, of course, they are important, but it needs to be done right and in a proportionate way, because on the one hand, yes, we get quicker access to the grid, but on the other hand, we're also being very, we are providing flexibility to the grid when it's needed, and that should also be taken into account and sort of regarded when drawing up the conditions. So that's in a few instances I've heard is a case. In some other instances I've heard it's not the case, that, for example, the grid operator says well, be grateful that you're getting connected now, but there's going to be zero reward for the fact that you're giving flexibility or something like this, and this kind of stuff. It's difficult to agree on, especially as you are in the business of giving as much power as possible, as quickly as possible to the driver.
Yep, indeed. So FCA is important, but more of a bridge solution. It shouldn't be the permanent solution. Perfect. Well, we're rapidly coming towards the end. Lots of, I think, already interesting takeaways. Agreement basically on the importance of planning, visibility, forward-looking planning, anticipatory investment, cleaning up the connection queues in a technology-neutral way that prioritizes system value. flexibility first, focusing on then also transposition, making sure things get implemented. There's lots of interesting, I think, consensus to be taken away from today. But maybe as a final question, and I'm asking for let's say, a brief answer. We had a very complex debate. I'm trying to simplify a bit with one takeaway message. If you could change one thing, if you could amend one thing in the grids package today, what would it be? And maybe we start with Raphael.
Okay, difficult question to answer this. This I would say this shortly. Yeah, I mean, for me, I would say again, very important to look at scenario planning, right? Scenario making, and really moving from a 4-year to a 2-year period, for example, having regular updates and regular I would say look at the future would be very useful. So I would stick with this one.
Okay, so 3-year planning from the energy regulator side. From the E.DSO side, Laia, one amendment that you could introduce tomorrow, what would you choose?
Yeah, so this is a hard one, but if I have to choose one, I think I would introduce a dedicated framework for anticipatory investments in distribution grids, because as we said, we can streamline connection processes. We can move away from first come, first served, but connections cannot be given if capacity is not there. So we have to understand that overcoming the maximum output of the physical infrastructure and the devices that are connected into the grid can result in outages, can result in blackouts. So we are always limited by existing capacity. So yeah, to have a distribution grid that is fit for purpose, DSOs must be able to invest in advance to make sure that when demand comes in, we are ready to connect, because this is what we are here to do. So that would be my take.
Thank you, Laia. And Gabrielė, I guess you are.
If we can really dream big, I would say take out all the permitting proposals and put them in a framework that's a regulation to ensure that enforcement is done well on a national level, and we can actually see meaningful change even in the short medium term.
Yeah, very clear. Thank you. So 3-year planning, anticipatory investment, and clear regulatory framework that is enforced across member states in a short time frame horizon. So lots of ways to address this coordination problem in a quick and efficient manner. With that, thank you very much. I will keep you, the audience, not too much longer, but to just quickly point you to our ChargeUp Europe amendments that we have just published on the grids package. We have recently published amendment recommendations on the Commission's grid package proposal. You can see on the slide what they all are. Again, I don't want to steal too much of your lunch break, but there are some proposals, for example, to extend the right to flexible connection agreements also to high power charging infrastructure, a lot of things on battery co-location and making sure that these kinds of flexibility enabling solutions of having batteries combined with your charging infrastructure can be enabled. Would recommend you to read them, highly encourage you to read them. They're available now on our website and on our LinkedIn as well. So encourage you to go there and have a look at the ChargeUp Europe amendments, and looking forward to also exchanging further with other stakeholders such as the DSO, such as the energy regulators on how to amend this proposal from our side. And with that, we come to the end of today's webinar. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to get in touch with our secretariat, and a warm thank you again to Gabrielė, to Laia, and to Raphael for sharing this hour with us and for your interesting insights. Thanks everyone for joining, and now enjoy your lunch, and see you around soon.